Hello and welcome to the Preserved Word. I'm your host, Pastor Brad, from Bright Star Church in Hopkins County, Texas. Well, I said something on Sunday that's caused many people to kind of scratch their head, and so I want to clarify, and thought it would be a good topic for the show this week. What I said was, and here's the other thing is, it didn't get recorded. Sunday's message, the audio didn't get recorded, so I'm not even really sure what I said 100%. I want to go back and hear exactly how I phrased it and see if maybe I just did obviously I didn't do an excellent job, but wanted to see exactly what I said. Doesn't matter. What really matters is what the Bible says. And that was the point. Now, here's what I said. I said that Jesus, in all the advice to the seven churches, we're going through the letters to the seven churches in Revelation, and Jesus Christ is sending letters to each of these seven churches that are in Asia, and some of them have some pretty serious issues, some false doctrine, stuff like that. And yet the advice Jesus gives it does not include leaving the church. And so by implication, I think I made the reference that we shouldn't be quick to leave a church, even if they're teaching false doctrine. And that caused some people to scratch their head, maybe rightly so. And so I wanted to come on today and sort of maybe add some clarity, but also talk just about what the Bible teaches concerning these things and what Jesus' advice was concerning these things and what we can practically do today concerning these issues. So it is true that in these seven letters, Jesus nowhere says, if this is happening in your church, leave and move, go to a different church. He doesn't say that. He doesn't imply that. And nowhere in the New Testament that I can find, maybe you can, but nowhere in the New Testament I can find where that is implied or taught as advice. Instead, what it does is it spends a lot of time teaching how to deal with false teachers, how to deal with false apostles, how to deal with false doctrine, and those who are pushing it. They are the ones that are supposed to lead the church, not the true believers. And that makes perfect sense, right? If faithful believers who uphold the word leave a church, they're abandoning those in that church to that false doctrine instead of standing up to it. Now, what I got told by some very godly people is that, well, I'm not going to sit under false teaching. I'm not going to submit myself to a church where there's a false doctrine being presented. I'm not going to submit myself to false teaching when I can go and get a good church that's just teaching the word. And I completely understand that. That's very practical and discerning. So how do those things relate? Here's the difference. The culture was very different then. Primarily, not in every case, but primarily, there was usually one church per these places. Probably Ephesus had more than one. There was a practicality of how many members could meet at the same time. But nevertheless, even if, like, for instance, in Ephesus, there might have been several different groups meeting, they were still considered to be one church because they were the church in that area. And so when a little town, maybe like Laodicea, when there might have been, the whole residents of that town they estimate to be under 500 people. So you're talking about a small group that maybe all met down by the river and all met at once and were to what we would typically call a church. But then you might have a different situation in Ephesus, especially maybe even in Antioch. Well, Antioch's not mentioned in the seven letters, but I'm just using it. Let's just stick with Ephesus. Ephesus is a larger town, larger church, probably multiple meetings going on. Probably the pastor of Ephesus, Paul was the pastor of Ephesus for 2 years. And he probably went around and met with different groups throughout the week. And yet it was considered one church, okay? The church at Ephesus, the assembly at Ephesus. So that's just a difference in sort of language and a little difference in culture. They didn't have these different denominations. Now, there was differences between in beliefs, and we can see that just in Revelation in these 7 letters where Jesus talks about the different characters of the different churches. And we can see that some of them had doctrine that wasn't good, that wasn't what was an apostle's solid doctrine, right? So, and nevertheless, even at that, there was just different things going on in the different churches. There was the persecuted church, and then there was the more affluent church. And so there was just different issues, different things going on. So there were differences between the churches. And even Paul sort of addresses this when he says, some of you say they're of Apollos, some of you say that they're of, I don't remember now who else he was comparing it to, but the point is that he was emphasizing there needs to be unity. We are all of Christ. And I think that's a good point. However, fast forward to our culture when we have so many different denominations, traditions, histories, and convictions. Now, we should all still hold to one doctrine. And that is taught in the Bible, that we should have unity. So the Methodists and the Baptists and the Presbyterians and whatever should all hold to one single doctrine. That is the Bible, okay? What is presented in the Bible as the apostles' doctrine, we should all hold to that. If you depart from that, then you are no longer, part of the Christian church. I mean, if your church is going to depart from that doctrine, then your lampstand is useless, I guess. But nevertheless, there's convictions within that doctrine that don't affect the doctrine. So, you have convictions of meeting on Saturday instead of Sunday, or you have convictions of wearing robes or having a particular liturgy. There's nothing in the Bible against it. It's just the conviction of that particular church that we're going to do things this way, and another church says we're going to do things this way. That's fine. But we all hold to the unity of the doctrine of Christ, the doctrine of the gospel. Now, so back to what I was talking about before. In this culture, however, there's a problem with how some denominations handle a doctrinal correction. So let me just use it for instance. There's a couple of churches in our community that hold to a word of faith doctrine, which is heretical. It's heresy. Okay, there's no other way around it. It's heresy. Okay, and those churches are teaching a heretical doctrine. And there have been people in those churches try to address that heretical doctrine, saying, no, Jesus did not lay aside his divinity ever. Jesus is truly man, truly God. So all the time. And to depart from that is to change the gospel. It is to change who Jesus is, and that's heretical. So this sort of people within these churches, as these churches have moved in that direction through teaching and books and just false teachings coming into those churches, there's been people to stand up and say, wait a minute, no. And what they're being told by the church leadership is that they need to leave. So they're being asked to leave because they're causing division within the church, or because they're not submitting to the authority of the church. And so here we get into this sticky pickle. Okay, if you the proper response, if your church is teaching false doctrine, or it starts to slide into teaching false doctrine, is to stand up and say something, to bring it to the elders, to go with a couple of witnesses would be best, and take this to these people. Take it to the elders. Say, this is not what the Bible. Take them straight to the Bible. This is what the Bible teaches. This is not what you're teaching. Is not what the Bible teaches. It's not Orthodox Christianity. That needs to be brought forward, okay, as correction. And it's the elder's job then to correct the doctrine of the church. If they refuse to do that, there is nothing in the Bible that really guides us when the elders of the church refuse to uphold or to offer correction to biblical doctrine. What do we do? According to the Bible, according to these letters that are directed towards the people of these churches, it says we are to stay. Now, hear me out on this, because I'm going to say something and then I'm going to sort of offer some practical so it has to do with how churches are looked at now versus how churches were talked about then. But okay, back to my point. You are to stay in the church and correct the church from the inside. Even if the church never corrects, then you are still to stay within that church offering correction for the sake of the people within the church. Now, does that mean you are to stay within a particular gathering? See, that's the difference. Back then, a church was viewed as sort of the church of a region. And I think, whereas now we view each individual assembly as a separate church. And that really wasn't a thing then. You didn't have the First Baptist Church of Ephesus and the Presbyterian Church of Ephesus. You had the church at Ephesus. And I think that that is a biblical way to look at it. So if you were to talk about my local town, Sulphur Springs, or maybe even Hopkins County, maybe, or you could go with the whole region if you wanted to, but you would say the Church of Sulphur Springs or the Church of Hopkins County. You're not to leave that church. In other words, you're not to stay home. You're not to neglect the assembly. But which group you go to? Okay, well, that is a different instance. That's a different argument. I'm going to go to this meeting, this group of the church that meets over here, because we have the great blessing of not all being able to fit under one roof, just like they did at Ephesus. All the Christians in Sulphur Springs or Hopkins County could not meet under one roof. There's too many of us. So even if we were all called Baptist churches, or we were all called, I don't know, you pick, the non-denominational Church of Sulphur Springs, even if we all went under that title, we still couldn't all meet at the same place at the same time. So, even though, we're going to gravitate towards what we like, what suits us: fast music, soft music, lights on during worship, lights off during worship, more liturgy, less liturgy, more structured liturgy, less structured liturgy, robes, no robes, choir, whatever, okay? We're going to drift towards those anyway, even if we all called ourselves the same thing. The point is, if you look at the Bible under these letters, under that criteria, you'll see that what is definitely wrong would be to stop going to church. Even if all the churches in your region are corrupt, if all the churches in your region are hypocrites, if all the churches in your region are all word of faith, you should not stop going to church. And you should not stop putting forth Orthodox doctrine. You should be talking with the elders every week, if necessary, or even more than one time a week. You should be arguing from Scripture to correct your local church. Now, if you have several varieties, which is in most cases, especially here in Sulphur Springs, you have several different varieties of denominations, and you have a couple of churches that are putting forth this false doctrine, this heretical doctrine of word of faith, and you go to them and you try to offer correction, and they say no, they refuse to accept the correction, and you continue to go to them, and finally they tell you to leave. They ask you to leave. Then what are you supposed to do? Well, then at that point, I think you just wipe the dust from your feet, as that was town to town, not churches. But Jesus offered that to the disciples, that if they refused to hear that they were the gospel, that they were to wipe the dust from their feet and go to the next town. Even though that was towns, not churches, I think that we can make that implication to say, okay, if we've offered correction, if the church that we're attending refuses to discuss or has reached a point where they're no longer willing to discuss the heresy versus orthodoxy, and they're asking you to leave, then I say, then you should leave. Does that mean if you leave without all that turmoil, that it's wrong? Well, I think that let me put it this way. I think the Bible wants you, I think the advice in the Bible is to offer correction. The Bible doesn't teach we should church hop or we should leave one church, even if it has some doctrine that is unbiblical. What the advice that we're given is to offer correction, is to bring correction. And that should be done by the male leadership of a household. If there should be, especially, hopefully there's more than one of you, you should come together as a group and go before, talk about what you're going to say, have some unity, and then go before the elders, with the pastor present perhaps, and offer correction, and offer biblical orthodoxy. That's the model that the Bible lays out for us. If you're a single woman and you don't feel comfortable being a part of a group, or there's nobody willing to be part of a group that goes before the elders, I think you should try that. You should try to do that. And if you can't find that, if there is no group willing, and maybe you just as a woman yourself, if you're the spiritual leader of your home, go ahead, go before the elders then and offer what you have to say. But then, if they say, no, we don't agree, we're gonna go this way or whatever, then I think you're free to leave. I don't think it lets us off the hook to say that just because we disagree that we should leave our local body. I don't think we should leave our church, our family. We're to view each other as a family. We don't just abandon our family because we disagree on something. And I think that's the biblical model. I think that even though today in our culture we have this sort of commodity version of church where we're going to go to the one that offers us what we want. I like this church. Well, I like that church. Okay, well, see you tomorrow. I mean, I know families where some kids go to this church, some kids go to that church, and maybe the parents go to a third church. I know families that go to I know some families go to two churches. And it's like this commodity version of church when it's supposed to be a family. It's a family atmosphere. And you shouldn't just float around. You should have some loyalty to your family, especially when you disagree. Because how is the church going to improve? And I think that we're suffering from that as people float around. First of all, it diminishes the value of church in the individual life. Second of all, you're not going to improve the church if they are wrong and you leave. How are you improving that church? If either go and find out, well, maybe you're wrong. Maybe the church is teaching it correctly, but you just don't like what they're teaching, but it's biblical, then you need some correction. But if they're wrong and you offer the correction, then you're making that church better in that way. And you're standing up for those who are sitting in that church, maybe you're younger Christians, less mature Christians who don't know the difference between the heresy and the orthodoxy. So, all right. I think that's enough. So I'm not saying the Bible says, Jesus says you should never leave your church if it's teaching false doctrine. I'm saying that you shouldn't flippantly. The Bible doesn't teach that we should. The Bible teaches that we should offer correction. Does that make sense? That we shouldn't just leave because we disagree. We should come together in unity and try to correct and try to. But if that's not being productive and that's causing division in the church, And especially if the leaders of the church advise you to leave, then I think that, then leaving and finding a church that is more aligned with Orthodox Christianity is the right way to go. So I hope that helps add some clarity. Maybe I muddled the waters even further. I hope not. Hope you're having a great week. Talk to you later.